Hello, and welcome to the Effective Literacy Podcast. On today's episode, we have part 2 of our interview with Dr. Kathy Escamilla, during which we will learn what we can do as teachers to analyze text in an effort to support our multilingual learners, as well as what's going on across the nation in regard to educational policy.
So we've heard you say a lot of different things that need to be incorporated in our curriculum. We've heard you say about the strong oral language base, that there has to be that strong moment of comprehension, that we have to have the foundational skills, that we have to make sure that we have that engagement, and that our curriculum has some sort of sense of belonging for our students. But could you really highlight any other pieces or characteristics of that effective curriculum or instructional materials really for teaching literacy for our English learners and our emergent bilinguals?
I would like to say a couple of things, and then maybe you can tell me if I'm going on and on and on and for ad infinitum. But when kids get to be intermediate in their levels of proficiency in English, they know what I call just enough to be dangerous. So we don't worry about them so much anymore because they're not beginners. We think, they're well on their way. And so sometimes, and because they're at the same time learning to read, and most of them are making some kind of progress, then we think that they're understanding what they read. I think we need to learn how to do analysis of text, because sometimes there's stuff in that text that it's beyond what intermediate learners can do and say, but it's really important to text comprehension. So in research that I've done, we've identified like 4 things, and I thought I might mention them. So things like modal verbs, could, should, will, and might. There's a big difference between you put these 2 chemicals together, they might explode, or you put them together and they will explode. And the difference is not something that we can shelter. The difference is in the modal use of will and might. So it's stuff like that. If you are a native speaker, we're not good students of our own language. We are good students of a second language because we don't understand it and we need to know all the details and we don't get all the nuance. But most of us are native English speakers out there teaching. And so sometimes this just goes right over our head, not because we don't want to help kids, but just because it does. Tag verbs, things like when you put a preposition at the end of a verb, it changes its meaning. So make, like make a cake, is different from make believe you're a character in the story, or make up after a fight, or make up a new ending to the story. Things like alternative questions. Would you rather be a king or a prince? And write about it. And kids write yes, because they don't really know it's an alternative. You can't say yes. Conditional. What would you do if you had $1 million? That's the stuff high stakes tests are made out of. Mm-hmm. And it's not vocabulary. It's not even syntax. It's just understanding that those are the kind of things that we value. And of course, idiomatic expressions, using elbow grease. I might know elbow and grease, but I don't know that the 2 words go together and make an idiomatic expression. So those kind of things, I think teachers of intermediate ELL kids, that's where we see them atrophying. We see them like making good progress and then just kind of going like that. And so again, incumbent upon us as teachers, but I think incumbent also upon people who are writing textbooks when they know there are, millions of kids in this country who need some extra help, to point out those kind of things.
So I'm just thinking, if I'm a classroom teacher and I'm looking at my curriculum right now and I don't see that opportunity to talk about modal verbs, to talk about tag verbs, to talk about conditional phrasing and idiomatic expressions, how can I make these adjustments in my classroom with still honoring the curriculum that my district or my school has bought for me?
Sure. Well, I think that so first of all, I think there aren't ELD curriculums that necessarily attend to this stuff. I'm going to say that. And nor do the regular English textbooks that kids are learning to read from say that. So we have to get better, to be better students of our own language so that we understand it. And I start with these 5 things because I know that teachers can get these 5 things. I know they can. And I know that they'll go to school tomorrow and they'll say, I'm going to start paying closer attention to the stories that I'm teaching. I mean, one teacher went on, as soon as I gave an invitation like that in a class, teacher came back the next week to class with just all kinds of examples. Like, did you know that hand-me-down clothes, that the kids in my class didn't know what they were? And, did you know that kids in my class don't get an allowance? And I'm married to a man from Mexico, and he doesn't get allowance. He doesn't get why you pay kids to live at your house. They take out the trash because they're part of the family. That's what you do. My kids disagreed with them, but that's so I do think that we need to, and I think that means our teacher ed programs also need to help teachers do that, because I think they're quite willing to learn.
Absolutely. So I'm starting to see a theme here, Kathy, that like we as educators need to keep being the learners, that we need to be better students of our own language, that we need to learn about our students, that we need to really learn about everything that everyone needs. And so I kind of love this theme. So along with that theme, how might I, as an educator, partner with the families, right, to make sure that my students are successful with effective literacy, that all of my students are learning to read, write, speak, and listen?
Yeah. I have a couple of examples of students. One student, she would always make sure, and granted, the kids she taught were all Spanish speakers, and it's a little bit more difficult if you've got multiple languages in your classroom. But we have this wonderful gift now of the internet, and my goodness, if I had access to the internet, I mean, things I would have downloaded and given to kids. But anyway, if in her classroom, if they were studying a theme like Kwanzaa, she would make sure that there were books, not the same book necessarily, but a book about Kwanzaa in Spanish, and she'd send it home and have parents read it with the kids, or have the kids read it to the parents if the parents couldn't read, and talk about Kwanzaa. So she never ever had a book in her class where she didn't have some kind of a partner companion book on the same theme or topic that she could send home for parents to do. So I think that's one way we can invite families. I think another way, this is going to sound strange, but what we know that skills transfer, but we also know that our biggest bang for our buck in terms of cross-language transfer comes in the productive and not the receptive skills. So the best thing parents can do for us, and believe me, I know this is a battle because I've had it with my own grandchildren, is that we tell parents, when you speak to your children in Spanish or Vietnamese or Korean, you demand that they respond to you in that language. We'll teach English at school. Okay, but when language gets lost, when the productive ability gets lost, so does the transfer opportunity. And so one way parents can really help us is with a skill they all have, and that's that they can continue to speak their first language at home and demand that the kids respond to them in that language. And parents are sometimes afraid of that. I mean, they're afraid to do that because they're afraid they're going to mix up their kids. They're afraid they'll hold them back, and they don't want to do that. And when that happens, it suppresses the opportunity for kids to continue to become more proficient in their home language, which actually helps English.
Absolutely, Kathy. I think that giving families the opportunity to keep those conversations going is almost, and I don't want to say the word permission, because of course we would never give families permission, but so often our families are asking us, what can I do? What can I do? And tell me, Maestra, right? Tell me. And when we say, you can keep doing what you're already doing as a parent, right? Like, what a relief. I don't have to change what I'm doing. I can just keep honoring what we're already doing in our home. I think allows families to also acknowledge that they are their child's first teacher and that they need to just continue what it is that they've already been doing. So that's such an honoring perspective to give to our families from the get-go. And it also really continues to highlight this idea of partnering, like you said. We'll teach English at school. You keep going with your home language. And then hopefully by the end of it, we have a student who's proficient in at least two languages, if not more.
Yeah. And I think we also tell them that they can dare to parent. Just because you don't speak English doesn't mean that you can't tell your kids, no, you do not stay on the phone until 10 o'clock at night. No, that they have good instincts as parents, and sometimes we make them feel like, oh, you're poor, oh, you don't understand the ways of this country, oh, this, oh, that, instead of saying, no, you are the parent. Demand that your children respect you, and here are some rules of the ways that you might ensure that happens at home. And you're right that there are partners.
So I'm going to ask you just to shift a little bit, moving from what's happening at the school site, that partnership with families, but also shift a little bit more to a state level or even a district level. Mm-hmm. When we think about what happens at the school sites, a lot of that is coming from policy mm-hmm. that's been decided upon, not always by a classroom teacher. Mm-hmm. So are there some educational policies, whether district or state, that, we're in California, you're in Colorado, are there some policies that you think are particularly good at supporting literacy instruction, specifically for emergent bilingual students?
Yes, I actually, I know what people say about it. Here in Colorado. We always say, "Oh, I hope no more people from California move to Colorado." Blah blah blah. I'm just kidding, because I love California people and I live there. But I'm gonna call out California's two policies that I think are particularly progressive, and one is very good. Is Proposition 58. It overturned Proposition 227, which it eliminated bilingual education and now actually encourages the development of multilingualism in schools. I think that's a wonderful policy. And I think, the challenge will be, of course, that you've lost a generation of kids because of the former policy that was not a good one. But also, I just read that the state superintendent of public education issued a statement that he was not going to mandate any one particular way of teaching reading. He just did that, I think, a couple of days ago. Mm-hmm. But instead, he was going to issue library cards for 100,000 children. That's fantastic. That is a progressive policy. And 1 million books for children's homes and ebooks. And he didn't impose a one-size-fits-all. That's a wonderful progressive policy. I think it's a statement to say, I trust schools and teachers to do the right thing. And here are some supports, by the way: library cards and ebooks and ways to get resources online. So I think that's very progressive. Texas, I know you're going to say Texas, but Texas actually has some a very interesting policy with regard to biliteracy and the teaching of reading in two languages. So whenever they pass a state initiative, like science of reading, let's use that as an example, although they don't have a specific one like that. But when they do, and it mandates that teachers do professional development, they develop a separate teacher professional development system for teachers in bilingual and dual language programs, so they can learn authentic ways of enacting the policy bilingually and with regard to biliteracy. So that is, I think, a very progressive and enlightened policy. New Mexico is, if they still have their old policy, had a very progressive policy about dual language. I had heard it's in the process of being changed, and I hope not. That would be a shame. But so those at least those two places, and Texas and California are big places. They're places where there are a lot of emerging bilingual kids.
Absolutely. And you kind of brought up a past policy of California's that we have since changed. But when you think about policies that are creating obstacles for students and creating missed opportunities for effective literacy, what kinds of district or state policies have you seen? You said you've been in education for 50 years, so you have a lot of perspective to share with us. Are there anything that of those policies that really stick out in your mind that created obstacles for our youngest learners?
My best example is, unfortunately, the state I live in. So we have a policy called the READ Act. And the READ Act is a third grade literacy act that not only promotes but mandates that all children are on grade level at third grade, but they only allow kids to do that in English. They allow you to teach kids to read and write in Spanish in earlier grades, but you can only take the test that shows that you're a proficient third grade reader in English in the third grade. So what we know is that there are a whole lot of kids who are very proficient readers in Spanish in the third grade, but they're not yet ready to take the English reading test, and that test is more a test of language than it is a test of reading, because we can show them that the kids can read. That is a huge obstacle. And as a matter of fact, we've just started implementing it, and the first set of scores came out and showed that about 40% of the kids who were English learners were not at third grade level. I hope we can change that, because that's just wrong, and that's a significant obstacle. It's also a disincentive to develop biliteracy for teachers in schools, and that's too bad. The state of New York has just, not the state of New York, but New York City has just mandated a one-size-fits-all phonics program for all elementary schools. It's making a publishing company very, very wealthy, because it's a very big school district with millions of kids, but I'm not sure that they're going to get their money's worth from doing a one-size-fits-all mandate.
Wow. It sounds like there's a lot of learning that's still, and a lot of opportunity for learning, right? By all of our policy leaders and policymakers. So, Kathy, we really want to thank you for this time. But before we let you go, in this whole theme of that we're constantly learning and we are all students of literacy, we really want to hear from you. What are you currently writing, personally or professionally? And then we also want to know, what's your favorite book of all times?
Yeah, that was a tough one. That's a really tough question. So I'm writing a book now about writing, and it's a book about biliteracy, and it's taking a look at children's development as biliterate writers, beginning in kindergarten and going through the 5th grade. And the work that is informing the book comes from children who are in a program called Literacy Squared, which is a research program that I'm involved with. So we had a few hiccups because of the pandemic and kids not being in school, and how hard it was for teachers to make kids write during that time. And, the issue, and I went through this with my own grandson when he had to write on the computer, and he, peck, 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 and 30 minutes later, and he had down 3 words. And that's what the teacher needed until they figured out ways to take a picture and, put it on there. So anyway, that's what I'm doing. I'm writing a book about writing and the development of biliteracy, and I'm very, very excited about it.
Well, as a administrator at an elementary level, I can absolutely say I think there are going to be a lot of people very excited about that. That's going to be amazing.
It seems like we focus so narrowly on reading. We haven't focused enough on writing and taking a look at what we should expect from kids and what they can actually do. So there's one thing if we just kind of let them, write on their own. It's another thing if we have if we're paying attention to how to teach writing across grade levels. And I think we'll be much happier if we are a little bit more inclusive in our literacy blocks of writing and opportunities to write. My favorite book of all times, I grew up in a really rural town in Colorado. And my favorite days in the summer were the days that the bookmobile lady came. It was a lady, she drove this kind of school bus looking thing, and it had wooden panels and all kinds of books inside, and you could check up to 4 or 5. And then she'd come the next week and you could check those in and check back. And so my career goal was to grow up to be the bookmobile lady. That's what I wanted to be. So when you ask me what my favorite book is, it's really hard. I do love Isabel Allende. I mean, I love authors. So I love Isabel Allende. I love historical fiction. And I don't like nonfiction very much because I don't like to garden or anything like that. But I always have something around, and I'm trying to illustrate to my own grandchildren that reading is an engaging and a fun activity. You don't need to have to do it for school for it to be fun.
Absolutely. Anna and I are big advocates of teachers of reading read, right? We all want to read, and we don't always read just for our own professional development. We want to read because it's fun and enjoyable and we get something out of it. So, Kathy, we really want to thank you for your time today. We've learned a lot from you, given us a lot of things to think about and to actually learn for ourselves. And so this is the Effective Literacy Podcast. We are so excited that you joined us today and are learning for us, and we look forward to you joining us next time. If you want more information about our show, about Dr. Kathy Escamilla, or about anything we mentioned today, you can visit our show notes at multilingualliteracy.org. So that's all. Thank you so much today.